Kurt Wagner's death was a pretty heartbreaking one, dying in an incredibly fitting way, at the hands of his own teleportation. When Bastion is targeting Hope Summers, Nightcrawler jumps to defend her. Predicting the teleportation, Bastion sticks out his arm and Nightcrawler impales himself on it. In a last effort, Nightcrawler manages to teleport to safety, saving Hope, but he dies soon after. Now, this death was really important because although Nightcrawler is eventually resurrected, his being in heaven was instrumental in Azazel's siege of heaven, which was a pretty major plot point. Number 9. Peter Parker. The death of Peter Parker was as shocking as it was tragic. In Amazing Spider-Man number 700, Parker was defeated by Dr. Octopus and killed. After switching bodies with Peter, Doc Ock kills him and swears to continue his legacy as a hero, becoming the superior Spider-Man. While later issues explain that Parker wasn't exactly dead, the apparent death was incredibly shocking to readers. Doc Ock later learns that Peter isn't quite dead, still residing in the back of his own mind, and eventually relinquishes control of his body back to Peter when he realizes that being a hero isn't all it's cracked up to be. Number 8. Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel's death was a big one for a number of reasons. It was one of the first major superhero deaths, and it was one of the most human deaths a hero has had since he died from cancer. After being exposed to the malignant toxins of Compound 13, Captain Marvel developed cancer that ended up claiming his life, dying in bed surrounded by his comrades. It's a pretty emotional death, and it was quite a shift from the previous superhero deaths that were mostly in battle. I think it was really important to show that heroes are still people. You know, they don't always die in glorious combat. Sometimes things happen in life that are outside of your control, even if you're a superhero. There's definitely a lesson in that. Number 7. Rorschach. When you view the world purely in black and white, it's only a matter of time before you get yourself killed, and Rorschach did just that. After learning about Ozymandias' plan to essentially scare the people of Earth into working together, Rorschach's dichotomous worldview doesn't allow him to keep his mouth shut about it, and forces Dr. Manhattan to destroy him. I love Rorschach as a character, and I think this was a really interesting way to kill him. His morality is put to the test, and he stands by his guns rather than bend his rules. Number 6. Jason Todd's Robin. This one was one of the least surprising to fans, but pretty shocking after the fact. As a result of a vote by fans with a tally of 5,343 to 5,271, Jason Todd's fate was sealed. He was to die. In A Death in the Family, Todd is captured by the Joker and brutally beaten with a crowbar. As he waits, beaten and bruised, for Batman to save him, he's blown up by one of Joker's bombs in a really emotional moment. While he is not the coolest or most powerful hero on this list, his death was particularly important because it brought about his rebirth as the Red Hood, who is awesome. Plus, I actually played Jason Todd in a short film, so I'm kind of biased on this one. Number 5. Charles Xavier. Professor X was one of the most significant characters in the X-Men universe. Acting as a mentor and father figure for countless mutants, he showed all the virtues you'd expect from a hero. His death was super tragic, particularly since it came at the hand of one of his favorite students, Cyclops. In Avengers vs. X-Men, Cyclops is struggling to find where his allegiance lies. As Xavier tries to push him away from the Phoenix and to return to the good path, Cyclops vaporizes him in a fit of rage, thus submitting to the Phoenix. While this wasn't the end of the Professor's story, it was horrible to see him killed by one he had helped and trusted so much. Number 4. The Flash. The death of Barry Allen was certainly an upsetting one to many fans. While attempting to defeat the Anti-Monitor on the planet Quard, which is the stupidest planet name ever, the Flash finds himself face to face with the cannon's antimatter energy core. In order to make the cannon self-destruct, the Flash does what he does best: runs really fast. Unfortunately, he ran too quickly and he ends up disintegrating. Now, this incredible sacrifice certainly paid off, saving countless people on infinite Earths, and it was a fittingly heroic end to this popular hero. Number 3. Wolverine. And this is one of the coolest and most heroic deaths ever. After a long life thanks to his healing factor, Logan finds himself weakened by a virus that halts his healing abilities. As he finds himself less and less capable of his usual mayhem, he learns that Dr. Cornelius, the creator of Weapon X program, has ordered his assassination. While hunting Cornelius down, Logan discovers that the scientist plans to test even more innocent people by adding adamantium to them. Logan tears open the vats of adamantium to stop it being used on the people, but is covered in the liquid metal as a result. He suffocates and dies, but not before stabbing Cornelius, finally getting vengeance. What a boss. Number 2. Batman. We've all seen the image from Final Crisis number 6 of a destroyed Batman being carried in Superman's arms. This came as a huge shock for comic book fans everywhere, as everyone thought Batman was just too cool to die. But when he faced up against Darkseid, we learned that even the Dark Knight can fall. In his final confrontation, Batman fires a Radion bullet at Darkseid, the same bullet that killed Orion, and wounds the villain. But moments later, Batman is killed by Darkseid's Omega beams. Thankfully, by the end of the story, we learn that Bruce is not killed, but in fact sent back in time by the Omega beams. But it was a jarring thing to see the dead body of the world's greatest detective. Number 1. Superman. Of course. Probably the biggest shock of all was when the seemingly unbeatable Man of Steel was killed. Even though the comic was titled The Death of Superman, readers didn't quite believe that it could possibly be true. But it was. For a while at least. After a long, incredibly hard battle, Superman and Doomsday put all their energy into one last attack, which leaves both mortally wounded. Superman dies in perhaps the most fitting way possible, in Lois's arms after defeating the ultimate enemy. Thankfully, Superman was not actually dead, he was just recovering in stasis in the time that he was gone, and he returns with some pretty luscious locks later on.
Number 10. Death of Jason Todd. One of the saddest moments in Batman's history for sure. While Jason Todd would later return, this moment still shook Batman to the core, and readers to the core. Even if you were one of the people who voted for him to die, or were annoyed by Todd as Robin, this moment was dark, raw, and shocking for everyone. During the series Death in the Family, the writers actually let the audience vote, and decide whether or not Jason would make it. Unfortunately for Batman, they decided to let Jason die. The fact that Jason and his biological mother Sheila look like they're almost going to make it, coupled with Batman's reaction, makes the story even more heart-wrenching. As Bruce searches the ruins of the explosion, his thoughts help to also paint a mournful picture surrounding Jason's death. This moment would also carry on and change Batman forever. It would also be a sad and shocking moment that would inspire writers to kill off other Robins. Yee. Number 9. Kitty Pryde in a Bullet. Joss Whedon's run on X-Men was something else. One of the examples of the drama he was able to stir up involved Kitty Pryde. After the Earth is threatened by a giant missile, Kitty phases into it when the team can't seem to access its trajectory path. What she discovers is that it is empty, a shell, not a missile, but a bullet. Unfortunately, the type of metal that the bullet is comprised of makes her sick, and causes her to become bonded with it, meaning she cannot phase outside of the shell. With no way to save herself and no way to stop the bullet, she is forced to do the unthinkable, and phase the giant bullet through Earth. She somehow manages to do this, and is presumed dead. The sacrifice she makes, combined with seeing her struggle to produce the strength to do this feat, is amazing and sad. Kitty Pryde was a loved character at the time, and still is, so seeing this happen to her is really tragic. Don't worry though, she wasn't fully done yet, it's still a comic, so she managed to return to the X-Men a few years later. Whew. Number 8. Iron Man dies. Iron Man's death scene is definitely one we will never forget. Robert Downey Jr. made Iron Man cool again. He breathed life into a character that was never fully appreciated until his portrayal uplifted Tony Stark. Seeing Tony die on screen in the MCU represented for many the end of an era, and literally marked the closing of Phase 1 for the MCU. First, we have pretty much the reverse of the moment that we saw in Infinity War. Tom Holland's Spider-Man comes over, letting Iron Man frantically know that they won the day as Tony is fading. Just like when Tony came over to him when he was dying in Infinity War. Stark's death scene was made even more sad by knowing what he was leaving behind. He and Pepper had both survived the snap and had a daughter. One of the saddest moments in the entire Phase 1 of the franchise was when Pepper comes over to a dying Tony and manages to keep it together, reassuring him by saying, "We're gonna be okay, you can rest now," only letting herself cry after he has passed. The funeral scene was also remarkably sad, with his daughter being promised burgers by Happy and seeming too young to really fully understand the levity of even what happened. Rest in peace, Tony. We love you 3000. Number 7. Superman vs. Depression. In the All-Star Superman series, we see Superman accomplish a number of amazing feats, but one of the most heartfelt is this moment, when he saves a girl from committing suicide in issue 10. He reassures her she was not forgotten as she stands poised on the edge of a rooftop, ready to jump because she was having a breakdown and could not get in touch with her therapist. His words of comfort are that she is stronger than she thinks, and that she can endure this. She has the strength. Depression can sometimes feel like it is more insurmountable than any problem or supervillain. So being there to comfort and support someone in the way of believing in their strength is smart, and it just feels really meaningful. The panels are also beautifully drawn, and the incident ends with the image of the girl giving Superman a hug as she sobs. Truly moving. Number 6. Gwen Stacy dies. At this point you might be thinking, so much death. Losing people is sad and hard, sure, but is this whole list going to revolve around the loss? Losing people is sad and hard, sure, but is this whole list going to resolve around loss? When so many characters have the possibility of just being resurrected around the corner? While you may have a point about resurrection, that is never a full-on guarantee. And a lot of the sadness in these deaths revolve around the circumstances of them. Jason Todd had just rejoined Batman and was a hero till the end. Iron Man had just won the day. And with Gwen, we thought she was safe. The original death of Gwen happens in the Amazing Spider-Man series when she is tossed to her doom by Green Goblin. But our web-slinging hero manages to react fast enough, shooting his web out to save her just before she hits the ground. Unfortunately, there is a sound effect that accompanies this moment that lets us know that Spider-Man's life-saving action has actually resulted in the snapping of Gwen's neck. While it has been debated as to whether or not Gwen was already dead before she fell, the fact remains that these are some sad panels. At this point, we know she is dead, but Spider-Man continues to boast that he has won the day and saved Gwen. Well, she's there, dangling, dead. Number 5. Barry Allen remembers Wally West. Wally West is trapped in the Speed Force and about to die when he goes to visit his Uncle Barry one last time to say goodbye. Whether you want to blame the loss of memories on Dr. Manhattan or the Flash, regardless, Barry struggles to remember Wally. But Wally tells him that is okay, and that he will die with love in his heart when he thinks of his Uncle Barry and all he has done for him and meant to him. It is a truly touching and sad moment. As he begins to fully fade away, Barry suddenly appears to remember his nephew and manages to reach out and save him. Many memories flood back to him about his wife's nephew and the two hug. Barry in tears reassures Wally he could never forget him, and so Kid Flash is reunited with his uncle and also once again saved by him. Duh. Number 4. Anytime Groot dies. Groot is maybe one of my favorite characters ever. He belongs to an alien race called the Flora Colossi, and his integration in the MCU's Guardians of the Galaxy, as well as the strange and iconic voice work of Vin Diesel who portrays him, made him exceedingly popular in the world of Marvel. We see this character die twice on screen in the MCU, and both incidents of his death break my heart. One is when he chooses to sacrifice himself at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy 1, and the second is when he becomes one of the victims to Thanos' snap. What really sells this as a sad moment is Rocket, who is also amazingly voiced in the MCU by Bradley Cooper. Rocket's reactions to Groot's death make it even more heartbreaking, and each time you already feel pretty awful about it because Groot is such a sweet character, even when he's capable of murdering so many people. Not sure what his official MCU death count is, but after just the first Guardians film, it's gotta be pretty high. When he dies the second time, he says what he always says, "I am Groot." But obviously every time he says this phrase, we know from other characters' interactions with him that what he means is something other than what we hear, that he is essentially just speaking another language. His last words in Avengers Infinity War were revealed by James Gunn to have meant dad. In the script, it literally just reads dad, meaning teenage Groot calls out to Rocket like a scared child, revealing he looks to him as a father while he dies. Oh, so sad. Number 3. Batman gets a letter from his parents. After returning from an alternate timeline in the events of Flashpoint, Barry Allen comes with a sort of gift for Bruce. In the timeline he was in, the Batman was actually Bruce's father, Thomas Wayne. And in that timeline, his mother, Martha, becomes the Joker after Bruce, their son, is the one who gets murdered. Barry ends up getting Thomas to help him defeat Professor Zoom and restore the timeline. Before he leaves, Thomas gives him a letter addressed to Bruce, of the timeline that we know. When Barry returns, he delivers the letter to Bruce, who obviously has not received a word from his parents since their death in this timeline. Bruce opens the letter to read it and fixates on his father's signature. Everything Batman has done was sparked by the death of his parents, and this letter and his father's signature understandably brings him to tears. It's not every day that we see the Bat cry. For this reason, this moment gets a high ranking on the sad moment list. Number 2. Tom Holland, Spider-Man dies. Or maybe I do mean Tom Holland. To many at this point, he is the only option when it comes to someone who is trusted to play our Earth 616 Peter Parker. This death in the MCU was maybe the one that I have actually felt the hardest. And even though I knew it was most likely going to be temporary, it still made me weep. It also made me worry. Despite everything I knew, part of me was worried as to what if this became permanent. By the end of Infinity War, I was running through all the ways the Avengers could band together and fix this problem. Not because of the millions of others dead, but just because of Spider-Man. The youthful optimism Holland brings to Spider-Man, along with some of his character's blissful ignorance, is what makes this death so tragic. Before this moment, his character is so eager to help, so sure and determined of everything working out, and yet there is nothing that can be done as he feels himself fading right before his mentor's eyes. Worse still, there is nothing Tony can do, as he hears Peter plead that he doesn't want to go before turning to dust. Number 1. Elric brothers attempt transmutation. After the death of their mother, the young Elric brothers work hard to figure out how to bring her back. Using their knowledge of alchemy, they decide to perform a human transmutation in an attempt to bring her back. Unfortunately, they are not quite at the level to understand the toll that will be asked of them and the type of creature that it will lead to them creating. It leads to them bringing back what they interpret is an empty shell of their mother, a corpse-like mess of a creature, in exchange for all that they have already provided, plus Ed's leg and Al's entire body. Edward also sacrifices his arm in exchange for bonding Alphonse's spirit and soul to his set of armor. The two were rough before they attempted the transmutation, grieving the loss of their mother, and the sad ritual leaves them in an even more depressing spot. It's hard to watch the two young, optimistic boys have to deal with the repercussions of their actions. Thank you so much for watching, Nerd Squad. I hope I didn't make you cry too much. There are so many sad moments within the realm of superheroes. When you're a hero, there is a lot that you end up having to sacrifice. When you're a hero, there's a lot that you end up having to sacrifice. An honorary moment that didn't make it on the list is the death of Uncle Ben in Sam Raimi's early 2000s Spider-Man. Man, that moment had me in tears when I was a kid.
And at number 10, Thanos and Christmas. We all know that Thanos sucks as a parent. Whether you've seen how terrible he was to Gamora and Nebula in the MCU, or you've seen the way that he treated his respective daughter and granddaughter in the comics, you know that universe's best dad is not a mug the Mad Titan has tucked away in his cupboard. But sometimes Thanos' cruelty makes you feel so damn bad for him. And while we will get more justification on why he is the way he is thanks to a revised look at his origin story years later, more on that coming up, stories like these still manage to gut punch you a bit, even without the full context. Now, Thanos does not celebrate Christmas, but when Gamora was a girl, he felt inclined to give her as normal of a childhood as he could muster. His words, not mine. This meant that while he was hardcore training her to be an assassin, he also made sure to celebrate birthdays and Christmases with her. Case in point, these panels where he finds a doll in some rubble, fixes it up, and gives it to her for Christmas. So why is this sad? Because it leaves us so conflicted. Look at the blackness in his eyes, but look at the happiness on Gamora's face. Yet we know how crappy of a parent he is. That, my friends, is a three-dimensional character. Moving on. And at number 9, Doom Goes to Hell. Despite being one of Marvel's mainstay villains, from time to time Victor Von Doom has been portrayed as a tragic hero of sorts. Perhaps one of the most prominent examples of this occurred in 1989's Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, A Triumph and Torment. Drawn by legend Mike Mignola, this graphic novel sees Doom attempt to save one of the only people he's ever truly loved, his mother. He's trying to rescue her from the depths of hell. Doom's journey ends up taking him to Mephisto, and he ends up incurring hell himself in order to save his mom. The whole thing is pretty tragic. From Doom's request for Doctor Strange's help, to Doom accepting flowers from a child, to, spoiler, his mother rejecting his rescue attempts, the whole thing leaves you feeling for Victor in a way that most readers never have before. Speaking of parents, in at number 8, Thanos' mom rejects him. Remember how we mentioned earlier that Thanos' origins were later explored, which then helped explain why the Mad Titan was, and is, so darn mad? Well, in 2013, a 5-issue limited series titled Thanos Rising was released, and it featured Thanos returning to his home on the Saturn moon Titan, getting all nostalgic, visiting the grave of his mother. We then find out that Thanos' mother straight up rejected him when he was born, literally seconds out of the womb, people. Thanos, who carries the deviant gene, looks different than the other Eternal inhabitants on his planet, who basically look like humans. The Eternals and the Deviants are mortal enemies, so, shocked by his appearance, she tried to kill him. Luckily for him, his father prevented this from happening, and later he would brutally murder his own mother by dissecting her. Oof. And at 7, Doomsday's origin story. Buckle in for this one, friends. So, Doomsday's claim to fame is that when he first hit the scene, he and Superman got into a colossal punching match that caused them both to knock each other out so hard that they seemingly killed one another. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But that's besides the point. When Doomsday was first introduced in 1992, we would learn about how this creature, who only cared about destruction and hate, came to be. A long time ago on the planet Krypton, there once was an evil scientist named Bertron. Bertron was a piece of work. He wanted to test evolution and use it to create the ultimate life form. Back then, Krypton was an almost inhabitable place. Its terrain was a hellish wasteland, but Bertron used that to his advantage. He took a baby and then tossed it into that wasteland. As you would expect, the baby died, no surprise there. But that is what Bertrand wanted. He then collected the remains of the baby and then used its genetic material to clone another baby, one that was theoretically stronger. And then he tossed it into the Kryptonian wasteland too. Despite the hesitation and reluctance of others on Krypton, Bertrand kept this up, doing it over and over and over again, cloning stronger babies and then basically torturing them, sending them to their deaths, and repeating the process for decades in order to achieve what he believed was a form of accelerated natural evolution. Eventually, the creatures survived the temperatures and the terrain, only to be killed by predators. Bertrand then repeated the cycle until the child could metabolize solar energy, adapt to whatever killed it previously, and could sustain itself entirely. So what did this creature do? It killed off all the predators on Krypton and then escaped, where it would then travel the universe, beat up some Green Lanterns, and eventually was killed off by a race called the Catalan, who managed to defeat it with a being made of pure energy called the Radiant. Doomsday was then given a dishonorable burial, wrapped up like this. But thanks to his nature, he revived himself, came back to life, and eventually ended up on Earth. And at 6, Korvac's suicide. Back in the late 70s, there was something called the Korvac Saga. The conclusion to the saga, which occurred in the Avengers issue 177 in 1978, the titular villain committed suicide, with his dying act being to restore the Avengers and the Guardians characters before he bit the cosmic dust. So, what happened? Let's backtrack. In 1975, Marvel readers were introduced to a new villain, Korvac, also known as Michael Korvac or the Enemy, a character who came from another Earth set in the future. After he fled to Earth 616, he attempted to download Galactus' knowledge. He was also a brilliant computer whiz on his Earth, side note. And in the process, he was imbued with the power cosmic. This is where he became a threat and showed up on the radar of the Guardians of the Galaxy. They go after him and enlist the help of the Avengers. Now, the Collector, who senses a great threat is on its way for the Elders of the Universe, creates a daughter who he named Karina. She's essentially a weapon, but she ends up falling for Korvac, betraying Daddy Dearest. Eventually, he and Karina are tracked down and forced into combat. And in a critical moment during the battle, when it seems that Korvac has won, Karina hesitates, and Korvac senses doubt in her. Within a split second, he realizes that if his love doubts him, there is nothing for him in this world, so he kills himself. It's not particularly gruesome or gallant. Korvac just drops, glows a little, everyone is revived, and Karina is horrified. In general, Korvac's tale is a tragic one. Towards the end, he just wanted to be with the woman he loved. Although he did come back, and that's a whole other thing, but Keeping things grim, at number 5, Zemo almost commits suicide. Taking a detour out of the comics and instead a look at the MCU, let's talk about Helmut Zemo and his scene with Black Panther at the end of Captain America Civil War. Obviously, spoilers if you haven't seen it, but it came out years ago, so that's your fault. So while Cap, Tony, and Bucky are brawling away thanks to Zemo finally getting his vengeance, T'Challa stumbles upon Zemo sitting outside. Rather than kill him, he decides to break the cycle then become a part of it, he chooses to let Zemo live, preventing the villain from killing himself, with the intent of turning him over to the authorities because justice, etc. Zemo has lost everything and doesn't really even have the satisfaction of successfully pulling off his scheme. He just misses his family. The whole scene is a bit of a tearjerker, but T'Challa does the right thing. And hey, that now means we get Zemo returning to the MCU in the upcoming Falcon and the Winter Soldier TV series, so I guess everything worked out in the long run. Or not. Zemo's still bad. Presumably. And at 4, Bane's origin story. Bane is a complex character in the DC universe, so it's fitting that he has an atypical origin story. Bane was born inside of a prison. If that wasn't bad enough, in this prison in Santa Prisca, it had been predetermined before he was even born that he would be serving out a life sentence in his father's place. That's brutal. Bane was raised by other inmates and was forced to fight for food daily just to survive. As you can tell, this prison was super rough, and when he was a small child, he committed his first murder in there, hiding a weapon inside of his teddy bear. By the time he became an adult, he was experimented on and presumed dead after one of those experiments, and was then tossed out to the sea. But Bane wasn't dead, and you guys know the rest of the story from there. And at number 3, Valeria. Another Doom moment on this list. This one is a bit more specific than our last one though. In Fantastic Four issue 54 from 2002, Dr. Doom ends up helping the Fantastic Four instead of fighting them, in a way that you wouldn't expect. When Sue Storm was pregnant and Reed was away on a mission, Johnny Storm had to call up Victor to help deliver the baby. Now this was due to complications with the pregnancy because of the cosmic rays that had given the team their powers initially. Using his mystical capabilities, Victor safely delivered the child and requested that in return she be named Valeria. So why is this sad AF? Because Valeria is the name of the woman he had loved in the past, his very first love, who he was forced to kill. Now to be fair, he didn't actually have to, and killing her was a ritual of sorts to get new magical powers from some demons, but still, he's sad inside, alright? feel bad for him. Up next at 2, Dexstar. Here we have yet another gut punch for you, especially for animal lovers. When it comes to animals, especially cats or dogs, it's hard to not sympathize with them when they're in need, even if that animal turns out to be a supervillain. Case in point, Red Lantern kitty extraordinaire Dexstar. Dexstar used to be Dexter, a stray cat who was adopted by a young adult living in Brooklyn, New York. And Dexter loved that owner dearly. Here's where the tragedy comes in. His owner was brutally murdered, which poor Dexter witnessed, so he was back on the streets, where he was then abused by street thugs looking for a cheap thrill. After they beat up Dexter, they threw him off the Brooklyn Bridge assuming he was dead. But instead, filled with rage, Dexter was granted a Red Lantern ring and killed his attackers. I don't know about you guys, but I really want to go home and hug my cat right now. Oh, why would they hurt a cat? But now he's a supervillain and can fight against them. Overall, I'm very conflicted, you guys.
Number 10. Superman. The death of Superman. For those of you who've been here a while, you all know how Kelly feels about the death of Superman, but we're gonna talk about it. Superman died in the now famous, or for some infamous, Death of Superman arc. Superman was killed by the villain Doomsday in 1993, in a battle that was too much for the Man of Steel. And this was more than just a comic event. This made news. There were broadcasts about the death of Clark Kent, and people were sad. But contrary to popular belief, at the time, fans were aware it was a marketing ploy. While some may have been worried they may never see Superman again, most were like, oh, they're doing this to get more sales, because it was known that Superman wasn't selling that well at the time. Cynicism and savvy aren't modern inventions. Even if you look back at the coverage, people knew things. Superman would remain dead for a while, leading to the Reign of Superman arc. The images of Superman dead, cradled in a sobbing Lois's arms with his cape waving like a flag, are now iconic. They are pieces of comic book history. And even if you knew he was coming back, it still tugged at your heartstrings. Number 9. Quicksilver. Quicksilver from the MCU. Now, as many have said, this character could come back, but for now, at the time of this recording, he's dead. Quicksilver in the MCU was more a victim of dual ownership and wasted potential than anything else. Quicksilver appeared fully in the Age of Ultron, and he died in the same movie. He died as a human shield for Hawkeye because he was starting to form distinct relationships with members of the Avengers, and some were hoping he would stick around. However, there was another Quicksilver at the same time, a more popular Quicksilver over at Fox in the X-Men universe, pre-Disney purchase. And there's an unspoken rule that companies don't like having two of the same characters on the big screen at the same time. For most, they felt this death was a waste, as he could have been incorporated into the universe. At this point, it's been years since Age of Ultron came out in 2015, but some feel it was a missed opportunity. Guess he wasn't fast enough. Number 8. Captain America. No, we're not talking about Cap putting himself on ice, we're talking about the end of Civil War. Civil War the comic event, the first one from 2006, Civil War 1. After Tony and Steve's friendship was destroyed by the pro or anti-registration argument that escalated from 0 to 100 in a couple of panels, and it was about as subtle as Thor's hammer to the face, Cap put an end to hostilities after seeing all of the damage that him and the rest of the heroes were doing around them. They were fighting each other, it was real intense. However, after Cap surrendered himself, he was shot on the courthouse steps, and this did not go over well. Captain America is a cultural icon in the States. He stands for more than just a character, so when things happen with him, it tends to have a ripple effect. His death here after the whole Civil War arc hit some people hard. They said it was like the death of American values. This was Hydra Cap before Hydra Cap. Of course Cap came back, but this ending did not sit well with everyone. Number 7. Green Arrow, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths is now not only a giant event from 1985, but a mega event in the CW television Arrowverse. It was the end of an era, the end of Oliver Queen, and Arrow, signaling the start of an Arrowverse, well, without Arrow. It was rumored for a while that the end of Crisis would see the end of Ollie, but for many, it was like the end of an entire era. His funeral was a veritable who's who of every character who had returned in Crisis, which was quite the cast of characters. For many who've been following the Arrowverse since it started, this was quite the moment. People can joke, but hey, we all have our shows that touch us and that we follow. Pour one out for Oliver Queen. Number 6. Jean Grey, the Phoenix. the first time. The Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas are now classic X-Men story arcs and were actually named that afterwards by fans. They are also home to a grand retcon once they concluded, wherein Jean was never truly the Phoenix at all, but rather it was a force that took her form and her body was in a cocoon under the ocean. This was 100% so that she was no longer responsible for killing billions of people when she blew up that solar system. Anyways, at the end of the trial of the Phoenix, Jean was able to recognize that she was out of control and couldn't handle the power in her body. So in order to save the universe from herself, she killed herself in front of Scott as he begged her not to. This was a tragic moment. Also, because this arc was a huge factor in making Jean popular, really popular in her own right. Jean's sacrifice was largely undone by the retcon, but it's still a classic moment. Number 5. Stephanie Brown. Stephanie Brown first debuted in Detective Comics number 647 in 1992, and managed to make quite a name for herself. The daughter of the Clue Master, she was seeking to forge her own path, and this led to her own vigilante identity as Spoiler. She would really take hold in Robin's comic, then Tim Drake, and would eventually decide to take on the mantle of Robin in her own right. It was here that her path would take a turn, and she would become involved in an arc called War Games. Here she would be attempting to assist Batman, but also he would not treat her exactly like other Robins. He wouldn't share information with her, information that would save her life, as she ended up inserting herself into all this gangland mafia warfare and she died as a result. This plot was extremely poorly received. When she was first seen in her hospital bed, fans were convinced she was gonna make it, and were devastated when she didn't, begging Batman to take care of her daughter. Even if you weren't the hugest fan of the character, how she was treated made Batman look terrible, when just some basic info could have saved her. Her death would sloppily be retconned a few years later. Number 4. Logan. We're talking about the 2017 film that decided that you had enough happiness in your life, time for some sadness. Logan was heralded as a retelling of the Old Man Logan comic, but it isn't really, not in story, but instead in tone. A dour, sad world where heroes have fallen and life is bleak. Seeing Logan fight to protect his daughter and a small cabal of mutants even as his body begins to fail him is heart-wrenching. All of this is as the movie moves towards its inevitable conclusion, that of his sacrifice. It's heartbreaking seeing him laying there while X-23 watches over him, but at the same time he gets to be at rest. It's another end of an era. Hugh Jackman is the Wolverine for many people, the only one they've known, and to see his end like that on screen, for some, was pretty touching. Number 3. Jason Todd. Jason Todd died by a vote, call in to decide whether he lives or dies, and his death was tragic for many reasons. Not only did many deem this vote unfair and cynical, but they also felt that to kill a teen was too dark. However, paradoxically for many, Jason had never been more interesting than he was right before he died, and it was his death and over time the increased sense that it was unfair that fueled the character's popularity enough for his return, or for him to stick around after he returned. Jason would most likely not be as loved as he is had he not died as he did. His death and its legacy, both in canon and outside of it, are part of what has made him the character he is today. The iconic images of Batman holding his impressively intact corpse, that of Jason Todd, are ones that have gone down in comic book history. The building exploded. There should be goo. Number 2. Rorschach. Yes, the Watchmen, the classic Alan Moore Watchmen for this number. Each of the heroes within this work are meant to represent a different philosophical viewpoint when it comes to heroism. They are also all meant to be inherently flawed as people. In short, everyone is nuanced. Rorschach is broken. Once an idealistic hero, after seeing the brutality people are capable of, it shattered him and he became cold, distant, cynical, and pretty judgmental. However, part of what made the divide so great was his absolute faith in what is right and what is wrong, and a disbelief in how far some would stray from that. Hence, when Adrian, aka Ozymandias' plan is revealed at the end, he can't live with it, even while the others can maybe see their way to it being for the best. Rorschach's convictions are so great, as is his turmoil, that he demands Dr. Manhattan just kill him because he will reveal what happened. And as he stands there, tears streaming down his face, Dr. Manhattan does just that. Makes him explode. It's sad on a few levels. 1, to see a character so torn, and 2, because of the purity of heroics he believed in. It's kind of like witnessing the death of that, erased by the ends justify the means mentality of Adrian. It's a standout moment in a work full of standout moments. Finally, in at number 1, Captain Marvel, dying of cancer. We are here talking about Marvel's first Captain Marvel, Captain Marvel. He had a unique death. Well, him and the question, but the question happened later. His death involved him dying of cancer. It is not common for heroes to die of such relatable means, and it made his death all the sadder. It was a special space cancer that he caught by trying to save the galaxy, but still. He died in the hospital surrounded by his friends, but received a surprise gift from his enemy, Thanos. He felt that he deserved a hero's death and organized for him to feel as though he was fighting in his last moments. This was until Captain Marvel felt he didn't need the illusion anymore and embraced death and walked off into the light with death and Thanos at his side. It was a big moment and it felt climactic. He would be succeeded by the second Captain Marvel, Monica Rambeau.
In at number 10, Doctor Strange. Dr. Stephen Strange was once a world-renowned surgeon. With such a high-ranking position in his field, many viewed him to be a bit of an egotistical jerk from time to time. In a freak car accident that nearly took his life, the doctor woke up in a hospital bed with his hands floating in casts before his very eyes. His entire profession depended on just how steady his hands were, and now with such terrible nerve damage, he would never be able to operate on patients ever again. You can imagine the psychological toll that this would play on your brain, having your entire livelihood ripped away from you after one accident. Luckily, in his search for a cure, which just seemed like a pipe dream at the time, he soon found himself in the Himalayas. After meeting the Ancient One and undergoing rigorous training, he was finally able to let go of the pain that this accident had caused him. In at number 9, Superman. We all know the story of Superman, but the majority of people gloss over just how tragic this origin truly is. Perhaps it's because after his ship crash landed on Earth, he was raised by such a wholesome family that fostered him and his alien powers. When you really think about it though, his home planet had exploded, which completely wiped everyone that loved him. A whole world full of people just like him was now gone. He now has the awful task of being raised in a world where he is the obvious outcast. Imagine finding out that you were adopted and then discovering that you're this mysterious alien. It's hard enough to discover your own life's purpose, but for Clark Kent, most of the time he would be dealing with split personalities his entire life. He has to be both Clark Kent, the average human, while simultaneously exploring his powers to rid the planet of evil. In at number 8, Daredevil. As the story goes in the first issue of the 1964 Daredevil series, a young Matt Murdock is walking home from school when in the distance he sees trouble brewing for an elderly man. Little did the man know, a truck was heading in his direction and death was knocking at his door. Not on Matt's watch though. In a heroic act, the teenager throws himself in front to save this elderly man. In the process of doing such a selfless act though, his eyes are sprayed with these radioactive chemicals. The man was saved, Matt survived, but the chemicals had left him permanently blind. Nothing says tragic like a teenager with his whole life in front of him being told by a doctor that he would be blind for life. Luckily, this is the comic book world, so he was able to spin this into a strength and become the superhero that we know and love as Daredevil. However, in any other world, this story of a hero sacrificing himself for the betterment of others is inherently a tragic tale. In at number 7, Spider-Man. The majority of these tragic stories begin with the hero having no powers, for which a tragic occurrence then leads to them either discovering or developing them. For Peter Parker, he had already been bitten by a radioactive spider that gifted him with his new powers. Although, with his newfound powers, he believed that this was his way to make some money in show business. However, with this distraction now in his life, it pulled him away from being at home to watch over his elderly Aunt May and Uncle Ben. As fate would have it, an intruder burst into the home, attempting to rob the place, only to fire a single fatal shot at Uncle Ben. Peter largely blamed Uncle Ben's death on himself for being too late to save him, even tossing his Spider-Man attire into a closet, wishing that he had never left. This is a tragic story not only because Peter takes the full blame of this freak occurrence, but it soon fills him with vengeance, which is not a great way to start a hero's journey. In at number 6, Dr. Manhattan. Born as Jonathan Osterman, the Doctor had lived a very normal life. It's July of 1959, and Dr. Osterman was in love with a woman named Janie Slater. She was a physicist like John, and at 30 years old, he had his whole life in front of him. The two were first introduced to each other by a good friend of John's from college named Wally Weaver. After leaving the Intrinsic Field Laboratory one day with Wally and Janie, John realizes that he left his watch inside. Little did John know was that the Intrinsic Field room was on a timer, and when he entered, the door closed behind him, locking John inside. When he tries to open it, Wally is on the other side and is quickly turning very pale. Wally realized that there was nothing that they could do to save him, and after being blasted by radiation, his colleagues watched helplessly as it essentially just vaporized him. This tragedy could be the origin of when Manhattan really started to separate himself from the rest of humanity. Additionally, he was blamed for the death of his friend Wally, who would pass away from cancer 20 years later. Man, that's tragic. And at number 5, Rocket Raccoon. Imagine a little raccoon running free, rummaging through trash cans, and building a home in the forest. Now, take those innocent beginnings and throw in an unknown, creepy, mad scientist into the mix. This is Rocket's tragic origins. Once a free animal doing his thing, he was kidnapped and experimented on. First, they surgically attached cybernetic implants and then gave this innocent animal the mental capacity for not just self-awareness, but consciousness as well. Then, the newly armed and murderous raccoon became a violent space pirate known simply as just 89P1. Never a good start when your new name starts with numbers. Combined with the psychological effect this would have on his new identity, Rocket was also aware that he was the only one of his kind. Now he leads the lonely life of being possibly the universe's only talking raccoon. In at number 4, Spawn. Typically the rule of thumb when it comes to origins is that the more terrifying the hero, the more tragic their story must be. Spawn fits this formula to a T. Born Albert Francis Simmons, Al was a contract killer, and after being betrayed by his best friend, he was murdered on the job. Soon, the once highly capable CIA operative is having his soul sent to the bowels of hell, and while there he strikes up a deal with a demon allowing him to return back to Earth. However, he never returned in the way that he left. Instead, he was a disfigured demonic entity known as Spawn. To make matters worse and beyond tragic, in the 5 years that he had been dead, his wife remarried. Although she didn't just marry anyone, she married the man that killed Al, while also letting this killer father a child? Needless to say, Spawn was more than a little bummed out about this, and not to mention, this deal he struck up with his devil was really a ruse to further the demon's unholy war against all life. In at number 3, Batman. As sad as Superman's story was and the whole not knowing his parents thing, a much more tragic story would be knowing them, loving them, and losing them right before your eyes. This is Bruce Wayne's story for all of eternity. He must live with the recurring nightmare of watching his entire life be destroyed in a dark alleyway, something that would mentally break even the strongest of human beings. When a common street thug robbed the Waynes at gunpoint, they refused to give in to the criminal's demands, causing the man to shoot them both, leaving a young boy alone with his deceased parents in the dangerous streets of Gotham. This was a pivotal moment in Bruce's life and became the obsessive driving factor for really everything. He began training day after day, seeking to destroy the entire criminal underworld of Gotham that took his parents. In at number 2, Rorschach. Ranking near the top as one of the more tragic origin stories, we have Walter Kovacs. Born into a terrible home, his father was extremely abusive and his mother was a prostitute. Walter's parents never allowed him to truly experience the world. As such, his view was that the majority of life on Earth had evil intentions. His father would mercilessly beat him while also taking away any form of education in his life. Ironically, Walter was born as a very intelligent child who actually was excelling in his classes and had displayed interest in religious education. His father's violence beat any longing for knowledge out of him though, turning his life into a series of heinous crimes. For example, at just 10 years old, he shoved a lit cigarette into the eye of an older child who was bullying him, leaving the boy partially blinded and sending Walter to jail. This was the turning point where he became the homeless vigilante who wears a literal psychiatric experiment for a mask and goes by the name Rorschach. Last but not least, in our number 1 spot, Eric Draven. This makes our number 1 spot because the tragedy in this comic book stretches beyond the pages and into the author's real life. The character of Eric Draven in the story of The Crow is extremely dark and was the way for James O'Barr to channel his anger and pain of losing his fiancée to a drunk driver. In the story, Eric and his girlfriend Shelley are returning from a romantic vacation when their car breaks down on the side of the road. A gang notices and decides to capitalize on the couple's misfortune. After shooting Eric in the head, he's forced to watch them brutally beat and murder his girlfriend before he too finally dies. Soon Eric is resurrected from the dead, given the gift and curse of immortality while being guided by a supernatural crow. Eric then begins tracking down each of these thugs and makes them each suffer the same brutality that his girlfriend went through. So tragic. think I might go cry into a pizza now.
Number 10. Abandoned by Stick. Really, Matt's story, as you're going to find out, is all about loss, tragedy, and grief. While there's a lot of ups for Matt Murdock, there's also been a lot of downs. One such high he rode was being trained by his master Stick, who began training him after the accident where he lost his sight, but at all other senses heightened as a result. However, shortly after his father's death, Stick too would leave Matt, and at a time when Matt really needed him too. Matt had tracked down the last man involved in his father's death. A masked Matt attacked him, but found himself overwhelmed by the women who worked there, who seemed to take out all their worldly rage on him, attacking him in kind. In the scuffle, he accidentally pushed one of them with enough force to send her crashing and falling out of a window. She would live, but the incident would awaken other personas living deep within her. This woman would become Daredevil's villain and sometimes love interest, Typhoid Mary. Matt at the time, however, believed he'd killed the woman and ran back to the gym in search of Stick. But Stick was gone. He had abandoned Matt because of what he'd done. Ouch. Sucks. Number 9. Getting involved with Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary wasn't just a person that Daredevil hurt, she'd also become a recurring love interest of his, on and off. And honestly, the moment where he accidentally pushed her out of a window could be considered one of the worst moments of his life, for how much grief Typhoid Mary would cause in his life both as an enemy and as a lover. Typhoid Mary suffers from a dissociative personality disorder, meaning she has personalities that reside within her that are more calm or sweet, but then there are of course also sides to her that are more violent or deadly, and each one is literally their own personality, separate from the other. Typically, the persona of Mary is her sweeter side, Typhoid Mary is her more villainous one, and Bloody Mary is probably the most violent, hate-filled, and unhinged personality of hers. However, it should be noted that while Typhoid Mary is one of the worst people to get involved with Matt, he was also likely one of the worst things in her adult life, at least, to have happened to her, with him re-triggering her split personalities to resurface. Although it wasn't him initially that caused the split, at least. That was trauma from her past. Some really intense trauma, to be real about that. And friends, before I move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want more Daredevil lists, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 8. His mother's fate. Not the fact that she became a nun, but more what caused her to leave her family. Later on, we would learn that Matt's mom, Maggie, had abandoned her children due to experiencing severe depression following their birth. As a result of her depression, she also became obsessed with Matt's safety and paranoid that her husband was plotting against her. One night, she became so distraught and confused by her depression that she tried to do harm to young Matt. Jack stopped her, but Maggie was overwhelmed with fear. Terrified, she felt the best course of action was to leave her family so she couldn't do any harm to any of them. She left, became a nun, and even after she recovered from her mental illness, did not return, leaving Matt to grow up without his mother, led to believe by his father that his mother had died when he was very young. Matt would not learn until much later in his life what had really happened to her. Number 7. The death of his father. Let's go back to Daredevil's origins. Right off the bat, life was pretty tough for Matt, starting out as a hero. His dad was Jack Murdock, who was a boxer, and always had dreamed of a better life for his son. And while Matt would go on to have a pretty good life, becoming a lawyer, Jack wouldn't be around to see it. Jack Murdock was killed after he refused to take a dive in a rigged boxing match. The fixer, Roscoe Sweeney, had been the one to order the hit, as he was the boxing organizer who worked with Jack and had ordered him to throw that match. Daredevil would pursue the fixer, attempting to get revenge for his father's death, but Sweeney would die of a heart attack during the chase. Number 6. Secret identity exposed. One of the worst things to have happened to Matt, multiple times really at this point, is having his identity revealed. There are a few instances where this happened prior to Kingpin even learning of his identity through information that Matt's ex at the time, Karen Page, sold him, but I would still say that the reveal to Kingpin was still probably one of the worst. Also, to be clear, Karen Page I don't think explicitly sold that information to Kingpin. She sold the information and then it ended up in Kingpin's hands. Kingpin used the information that he got to make Matt's life a living hell, ruining his civilian life, leaving Matt destitute, with even his reputation as Daredevil and even his costume left in shambles. It really was a rough time just all around. Number 5. Depression. While the revelation of his mother's fate and the death of his father was hard, something else that Matt would inherit would also prove challenging for most of his life. That was Matt's own depression. Like his mother before him, Matt has also struggled with his own emotions and mental health throughout much of his life. We later learn that the struggle of depression is also seemingly Matt's every day. Depression isn't something that he can really escape, but the silver lining is, although he's felt the weight of it, he's also learned how to cope with it. Not necessarily recovering from it fully, but definitely definitely finding a way to live life with his depression and at times kind of move through it, refusing to let it overwhelm him, even at times when, based on what was going on, this likely seemed or felt impossible for him. As a result, Daredevil as a hero likely possesses some of the strongest willpower throughout Marvel's characters. I think it goes like Doom and then Daredevil, with maybe one or two people in between them. I feel like if you're depressed every day and you're constantly struggling and being a superhero and dealing with all of the other, stuff in life, that's pretty impressive. You gotta have a strong will. Number 4. Shadowland. The Shadowland story was really brutal for Matt Murdock and also for readers and fans. DD ended up becoming the leader of the Hand, but it would later be revealed that he was actually not in control of himself during this time, as he was possessed by the Beast of the Hand, a demonic entity. Daredevil did a lot of awful things during this time, including killing Bullseye, building a mighty fortress known as Shadowland, and attempting to kill BFF Foggy. No, not Foggy. All in all, the whole event was a rough go for Daredevil, and by the end of it, he was forced to leave Hell's Kitchen and go on a journey of self-discovery as he tried to find his way back to his initially heroic path. Shadowland was rough overall. It's a rough time in Daredevil's story. Number 3. Marriage to Mila Donovan. So all in all, although Daredevil considered it in retrospect to be a mistake, I'm not trying to say that their whole marriage was awful, because that's not what happened. Matt and Mila had some good moments, and there was a time that they were both happy together, but ultimately their marriage ended up causing them both a lot of pain in the end overall. At one point, Mila herself didn't even believe that their marriage was ever real, convinced that Matt had manipulated and lied to her. She filed for an annulment, and it hurt Matt to receive the request and even have to consider that. However, Matt and Mila would make it past this and eventually end up back together, seemingly happy for a time. But her worry over Matt's safety would cause her to seek out the help of a therapist, who was secretly Mr. Fear in disguise. Oh goodness. Instead of helping Mila, Mr. Fear actually only made things worse for her, causing her to become more fearful and paranoid. Eventually, Mila did enough harm that she was arrested and considered criminally insane after she accidentally pushed someone into the path of a speeding train. Don't think Mila has ever recovered from all of that terrible stuff that happened to her. Alas. I mean, at least she's still alive, I guess? As we move on to the next points. Number 2. Death of Elektra. While she may have been returned to life later on, the death of Elektra, Matt's first love, still hit him hard. The two hadn't been together for some time, but had dated back in college before Elektra mysteriously disappeared. She resurfaced years later and was revealed to be an assassin, competing to become the Kingpin's #1 hitman. Or hitwoman, perhaps. Unfortunately, she was up against Bullseye, who decided to kill off his competition. He and Elektra had a dramatic fight that ended with an iconic panel showing her being stabbed through with her own sai by Bullseye, but only after he had already seemingly cut her throat by throwing a playing card at her, so don't forget that part. While Elektra and Daredevil weren't together at the time of her death, her fate at the hands of Bullseye still haunted Matt, and he probably still thinks back to that moment and is like, even though Elektra is alive now. Number 1. Death of Karen Page. Yeah, Daredevil loses a lot of people that he cares about. Honestly, it's no wonder he struggles with depression, considering just how much loss he suffered in his life. I mean, that's gotta be really hard. Karen Page was another close person who became a victim and a target as a result of being so close to Matt, aka Daredevil. For many years, she was Daredevil's confidant, his on and off again girlfriend who knew of his secret identity. In fact, I believe Karen Page was one of the first people, don't quote me on this, but I think she was one of the first people to actually find out about Matt's secret identity as Daredevil, so yeah. Eventually, her closeness to Matt put her on a very dangerous collision course with one of his arch nemesis, Bullseye. As Bullseye, who pretty much never misses, targeted Daredevil with his own billy club, Karen jumped in front of the projectile to save Matt, and in so doing was killed as the billy club penetrated her heart. What do you think are some of the worst things to have happened to Matt in the comics? How about in the live action series? Was the Netflix series ending and us losing Charlie Cox one of the worst things to happen to DD for you? Does it also strike you as weird that back in the original comic book series, he is always constantly reminded that he's blind? Or is that just me?